Clark Kent or Superman? Who is the Man of Steel's true self? Which persona is the real one? Is Superman pretending to be Clark Kent, or is Clark Kent acting when he becomes Superman? Some might say it's Clark Kent, others would say it's Superman, some might even say it's neither or both. So let's dive in and talk about who the Man of Tomorrow truly is, and how Superman adaptations should be portraying the last son of Krypton. When speaking on the main continuity of Superman, the pre-crisis interpretations of Superman generally assumed that Clark Kent was the disguise and Kal-El was his true self. In pre-crisis, Superman held little regard to his Clark Kent identity and even almost gave up being Clark Kent and taken on a new secret identity. Then post-crisis, it completely flipped, and DC gave Superman a greater grounding in Earth culture and humanity rather than the Kryptonian heritage of the pre-crisis version. Here, Superman is considered the disguise and Clark is the real person. In other continuities, it goes from either being Clark or Superman or a mixture of both as who Superman's true personality really is like, but it just depends on who the writer is and the kind of Superman that they want to tell. Superman has had many adaptations in movies, TV shows, radio, anything, everything. He's been around for such a long time. So let's start all the way back in the beginning. We're starting where it all began back in the 40s and 50s in Superman's first live-action appearances. Superman was first portrayed by actors Kirk Alyn and George Reeves. Their takes on the characters had Superman be the true self, with Clark being the disguise. And there wasn't really any difference to when they were acting like Clark compared to how they were acting as Superman. They both portrayed the character as just having one personality. His Superman self was pretty much his entire personality, even as Clark Kent. But as Clark Kent, they were both like competent reporters. There was no clumsiness or stupidity. Their Clark Kents had serious demeanors. I don't want to say their Supermen were both just kind of one note. It was the 40s and 50s, and there wasn't a lot of like nuance in the writing department. The Supermen you get here are really a product of their time. After they were introduced, and over the years, Superman had become very popular in animation. There's so many animated versions of Superman, and animated Superman had a mix of being adapted to where Superman was the real disguise and Clark Kent was the real disguise, and there were other mixtures of the real personality in there. I'm mainly going to be talking about the animated Superman we have seen from the DCAU, as that's the version that is most popular. If I dove into every animated version of Superman's true self, we would be here for like 3 hours. DCAU Superman has Clark Kent as the true identity. In Superman the Animated Series, Superman even says,
"But I am Clark. I need to be Clark. I'd go crazy if I had to be Superman all the time."
Let's shift gears from the most popular animated Superman to the most popular live-action Superman, which is Christopher Reeves and his 4 Superman movies. In this take on the character, Superman was the real personality, and Clark Kent was the disguise. Richard Donner, the director of the first Superman movie, even stated that he believes Clark Kent to be the disguise. His bumbling Clark was always a cover-up for his Superman identity. I gotta say, Christopher Reeve did a really good job of making both characters feel really different from one another. I've never seen a Superman adaptation since the Reeves movies that played both Clark and Superman so differently to the point where it's believable that no one would recognize that Clark really is Superman. Then you have the Superboy TV show, who was played by Gerard Christopher and John Newton, and for most of its run, Superman was an exact copy of Christopher Reeve's Superman, but worse, and as Superboy. Superboy was the character's true self, and Clark was the fake persona in this series. Clark is your clumsy, all over the place, hunched over Clark Kent in the series, just like Christopher Reeve's Clark Kent. In the 4th season of this show, though, they did make Clark more competent and less goofy, which really benefited the show. The Superboy persona was pretty much the same throughout the show's entire run for both actors that played the role in this series. The next iteration of the character was in Lois and Clark's version of Superman. There's one quote in this series from Clark himself that sums up the Man of Steel's true self in this series really well. That pretty much sums that up, and this show is called Lois and Clark. They really focus more on Clark in this series than the Superman side of him. Now, the next Superman adaptation is Smallville. Smallville was so groundbreaking for the way superhero stories could be told, and Smallville was the start of a new era in superhero content. The show even gave us an early version of the Justice League for the first time in live action, not including the 1990 TV movie, because we don't talk about that. That just does not exist. Now, with Smallville, it's a bit of a unique and complicated situation when it comes to Clark Kent in this series, because Clark starts out as kind of like the Reeves Clark Kent in like his freshman, sophomore year of high school, where he was a shy, clumsy guy who has a really great heart, but then turns into a confident jock who's very good at football by the 4th season. Then he turns into a confident farmer guy, I guess, then a confident guy who works at the Daily Planet. But then in the final season, he has to back to being clumsy Clark again and put up a disguise when he's at the Daily Planet. Then when he goes around as the Blur, that's all a disguise too, with not really showing his face. And when he does show his face, he's still learning how to do all the right things and say all the right things, and he kind of puts up like this bit of like a superhero act, you could say. The true personality is just the teenage scrawny farmer boy that turns into the farmer man, which is just the Clark Kent that we follow for all 10 seasons. And the reporter Clark Kent that we see in season 10 and the Blur are the disguises in this series, along with him actually being Superman, which is the disguise as well. We also get parts of his alien side too, and him being Kryptonian changes him throughout all 10 seasons. At times, Clark tries to become more alien than human, embraces his Kryptonian heritage more than his human side. Then there's times where he drops his Kryptonian side and becomes very human. By the end of the series, he embraces all parts of himself. There's so many different sides and layers to this version of Clark Kent that we see throughout all 10 years. But his true self is Clark Kent, not the reporter, bumbly, clumsy guy, not the Blur or Superman, and not even like completely his Kryptonian side or human side. It's a mixture of both his Kryptonian and human side, and all the things that he goes through throughout all 10 seasons that really makes the true character of Clark Kent in this series. Moving back to looking at Superman in the movies, we have Brandon Routh's Superman in Superman Returns, and also his brief appearance in Crisis on Infinite Earths. And this Superman is pretty much Christopher Reeve's Superman, which makes sense because this movie was supposed to be Superman 3 to the Christopher Reeves movies, but at the same time, it was not supposed to be a Superman 3. If that doesn't make any sense, that's because it really doesn't. You gotta ask what Bryan Singer's intentions for Superman Returns was, because there's no concrete answer to that question, and it's just a confusing mess, and there's a reason why there wasn't a sequel to Superman Returns. Superman is the real personality, and Clark is the disguise for this version of Superman. Except here, Ralph doesn't really sound too different from when he is in his Clark self and his Superman self. Like, Reeves really changed his height, voice, and everything. It was like Reeves was playing two different characters, but here Brandon Routh doesn't have two drastic personas as Clark Kent and Superman. Ralph's voice is relatively the same as both Superman and Clark Kent, except his voice as Superman is more stern. Moving on to the DC's first cinematic universe's version of Superman, which was played by Henry Cavill. And for the DCEU Superman, there's just one personality, which is just Superman. It honestly reminds me of George Reeves' version of Superman and Clark Kent. Superman in the DCEU doesn't put on an act when he is Clark or has a different personality. Honestly, it kind of seems like he doesn't care about being exposed too much. It's just the same guy with no changes, which honestly is just kind of annoying. I was okay with how Superman was portrayed in Man of Steel, because it was before he became Clark Kent, the reporter. But in Batman v Superman, Clark had the same personality as he was in his reporter self as in his Superman self. It's all the same serious demeanor. Now with the latest incarnation of Superman today, which is played by Tyler Hoechlin, and he plays the Superman of the Arrowverse. And there's two versions of the Arrowverse Superman. We have the Earth Prime version of Superman, who's the Superman that we were introduced to on Supergirl, and the Superman that we have seen in the crossovers. This Superman feels very bubbly, but serious when he needs to be. His Clark Kent is kind of like Reeves' Clark Kent, but less of a squeaky, hunched over Reeves. He kind of plays it like Reeves a little bit, but he also makes it his own. Clark is the true personality in this version of the character. Clark Kent truly is a red and blue Boy Scout on Earth Prime. Then we have the other Arrowverse Superman that was supposed to take place on Earth Prime with Arrow, Flash, and Supergirl and be connected to the Superman we have seen this whole time in the Arrowverse, but the show became its own universe and separated from the Arrowverse continuity at some point when they were making the first season. This version of Superman kind of has three personalities. There's Clark Kent, the reporter. There's Superman. With the Superman, he just acts a bit more serious and kind of reminds me of a bit of a politician in some ways with how his demeanor is, but also is a guy who smiles and cracks jokes and is just very human. Then there's the real Clark Kent that we see with his family, friends outside of the reporting life, which is his true self. This Superman is Clark, but without the clumsy act that he does. The Clark we see as a father, a friend, and a husband is the true personality of Superman in this adaptation. Alright, this part I'm going to be completely coming from a subjective standpoint. I know I was adding a bit of my opinions to some of the interpretations and adaptations of Superman. Throughout this it was supposed to be objective video. I like when Superman's true self is Clark, and Clark is very awkward but nice with a big heart and feels very human, someone that can laugh and smile and cry and show all types of emotions. That's why my favorite versions of Superman come from Superman and Lois, the DCAU, and most importantly, Smallville. Smallville has my favorite adaptation of Superman and Clark Kent. I know he didn't really become Superman in the series until the final episode, and we never really saw him in the suit. But when he was going around as the Blur, he was pretty much acting like Superman, but without calling himself Superman. Clark is a dorky farm boy with a heart of gold, and Superman is more of an act. Smallville, DCAU, Superman, Lois really show who I believe the character truly is, and what I like from the character. Now let me be clear, Superman isn't truly a disguise. Everything he does and says isn't an act, but Superman is more of the disguise by how his demeanor is different from Clark Kent. He's not truly being himself. The way I like to think about it is that Superman is Clark's work self. You know how when you go into work and you have to act differently than you would when you're outside of work, and when you're with your boss, you have to act a certain way, and you speak in a work voice sometimes depending on the job you have. But at the end of the day, you're still yourself at work. You have to change yourself a bit to fit in a working environment. Well, that's how it is with Superman and Clark Kent, in my opinion. Clark goes into work mode as Superman. That's just me though. There's a reason why Superman has been adapted in so many different types of ways, and there's no true way to adapt Superman just in general. Different writers see the character in different ways. Every fan, writer, and even hater has their own perspective of who Superman really is and what the character means to them.